Hi, we're going to take a minute to look at performance assessments and the role that they play in my high school math classroom. So for my performance assessments in my classroom, considering I'm a high school math teacher, I would like to call them all, and I quote, works in progress. I love the idea of performance assessments, and later on we'll look at the pros and the cons, the things that work and the things that don't work. The examples I have here are things that maybe don't meet all the criteria of a good performance assessment as spelled out for us in the book, Transforming Schools Using Project-Based Learning, Performance Assessments, and Common Core Standards. They might not meet all of them, but I feel like they have the potential to, and the more I learn about, the more I grow as a teacher, the more I plan to use these types of assessments as performance assessments. So even though they might not completely meet the criteria now, I do think that they have the potential to. So I see the most of this project-based learning applicable to my consumer math class, which is a math I teach the high school level, ranging from all grades in high school. It's not a required class, so it allows me to kind of jump around the standards a little bit more. It gives me a little bit more flexibility with what I hit. And it's a great way to look at applications of math. So the first potential performance assessment that I did in my consumer math class was a project based on fallacies and ads. So here's just a quick overview of what I assigned to my students, taken right out of Blackboard, a screenshot right from Blackboard. And the first chapter we looked at in my consumer math curriculum talked about fallacies and ads. So ways that we misinterpret information, or ways that ads or campaigns, political campaigns, use information and misconstrue it. So we talked about all these different types of fallacies that we could see. So even though it wasn't your traditional math lesson, it talked about ways to critically think, which I think is a big overview topic of what math should be. And then it required the students to go do their own research, look for ads, whether it be on the internet, the TV, magazines, campaigning. Particularly in the next election year, this will be a great project for them to do. And then for them to talk about what kinds of fallacies were applied and how they could do that. So that is something that I feel like hits the performance assessment criteria, in that what they're doing in order to do the research to find the fallacies is something that they would do to know how to use it. So they're researching these ads to decide, hey, are they misconstruing this information in any way? The next performance assessment type project that I've assigned in my consumer math class was a budget web quest. And this was an interactive web quest that the students did that I created, and they had to put themselves in the shoes of a recent high school graduate, and budget what a year would look like living on their own. And so I included with that a lot of resources. Click here to see how much you'd estimate your groceries to be based on your circumstances. Click here to estimate what rent will be and where you want to live. They actually picked out an apartment. And then they had to make sure that they had a surplus at the end of the month. So it required them to use those traditional budgeting skills that we talk about in a money math class or a consumer math class, but it required that they do it in a critical thinking way. It also required that they evaluate on it. They do a reflection piece. So I think, again, this hits that performance assessment criteria, in that those students are doing a task that's relevant to them, that's utilizing what we're learning from the textbook, what we're learning from the homework assignments, and putting it into play in the classroom. And the last one that I've done in my consumer math class was a probability group project. And this was a project where students were to work in groups and design their own game, something like they'd see at a carnival or amusement park. And then they had to calculate the probability of winning that game. And this looked different for different groups. I actually incorporated this with a data-driven instruction type of assessment, where I grouped the kids based on their testing scores from their NWEA test, and required different pieces of probability based on where they fell in their RIT range from their NWEA scores. So it kind of hit on a couple topics here, but really it was an application of probability. Why do we care about probability? And it even took a look during the write-up portion, which included a reflection piece about the probability of lotteries and casino games. And it requires students to kind of do that higher level thinking of, is that something that's good for me? Is it something that's good for my family? And so on. So again, kind of hit on a couple things here, but definitely has the potential to be a good performance assessment that could span multiple contents. In my pre-calc trig class, we call it pre-calc semester 1 and trigonometry semester 2, the closest thing to a performance assessment that I've taught is my unit circle project. And if you're familiar with higher level math, the unit circle incorporates a lot of different concepts and continues to follow throughout higher level math courses, calculus 1 through 3 and even beyond. We reference that unit circle. And so I wrote them their instructions here, but they were allowed to use any medium that they chose to build the unit circle with an explanation. And this one actually also required a presentation in class of the project that they came up with. And I've done this now for 2 years, and I really like the results. Considering I'm an online teacher, I have a hard time requiring students to memorize things because I can't monitor that. I can't say you need to memorize this unit circle, but then when they're testing, I have no way to monitor whether or not they are actually using the unit circle. So I thought this was a great way to go beyond that rote memorization, to go beyond just regurgitating. There are a lot of different methods to, and I quote, create the unit circle. The textbook we use looked at a method of using special right triangles with 30 to 60, 90 triangles, 45, 45, 90 triangles. So I taught it that way, but I allowed them to do their research. Kids found all sorts of neat tricks online that they then reused in their own format. I had a Prezi. I had a student actually create this flower. She put it in a pot, and each of the petals were color coordinated with different points on the unit circle. I had a student just strictly create a video of himself drawing the unit circle as he focused on different pieces of it. And then they presented those to the class. And again, maybe not quite hitting all of the criteria of a performance assessment as described in our required readings, but I think, again, having the potential to, as I continue to grow as an instructor, create this into a project where students are doing, they're not just regurgitating. And in the long run, hopefully then having that a little bit more thorough idea. The last two that I've got listed here, first one for pre-calc, we did a large writing assignment. And again, just kind of the write-up that I had for them in their Blackboard class required a couple-page long explanation of solving one of two problems they got to decide. And I know that our readings talked about how a writing assignment isn't necessarily performance assessment, and I do agree with that. But in terms of what we traditionally do in a math class, a writing assignment was really something that did approach those Common Core standards and looked at them, and the kids had to explain the how and the why. The big part was, if you're adding 5 to both sides, why are you doing that? What allows you to do that? What's your ultimate goal? And they had to write about all of those things and include them. So again, maybe not hitting all the performance assessment standards, but approaching it and requiring students to go beyond just, here's my answer. But it was rather, here's why this is my answer. And something like this, in addition to the last one I listed here for my geometry, this is my first year teaching geometry at the online school, so I haven't quite hit that level where I'm really ready to step outside the box of the most traditional teaching. I'm working on that. That's in my long-term plan. Maybe next year I'll definitely be able to incorporate more of that. But what I do a lot of in geometry is include a lot of mini writing assignments. So as opposed to the large writing assignment like we did in pre-calc, the mini writing assignments are typically just a paragraph or two where students can describe the answer to a problem or describe why or how of a problem, but in a much shorter medium. And this is a lot of what we're going to be seeing in our PARCC testing as they change that testing to be more standardized and less, or more Common Core and less of the fill in the bubble. So again, it has the potential for being those performance assessments. They're just not quite completely at that level. But those are the things that I work with in my classroom. With the research I've done this week in class, I do feel prepared to expand on those in my coming years to really build them into solid performance assessments. Now, for my class, who designs the performance assessments is really just me. Although we do have weekly team meetings, and my team is made up of all of the high school, or I shouldn't say all, is half of the high school teachers. We meet every other week or once a month at least and collaborate. We don't have any sort of performance assessment school-wide or cross-curricular at all in place. So at this point, all of them have really just been designed by me. I did have a little help. Last year I actually started in September, about 4 weeks into the school year, and I was replacing a teacher who was transitioning to become special education. So I have had help from her in designing some of these, or starting with her idea and molding them into my own. And I certainly do still collaborate with her frequently in terms of making the projects the best I can. But really the design comes from me. How are they organized? We looked at a lot of them, and there's just a big variety of it. For the most part, if kids want to know what they do, they go to their Blackboard and they can read about what the assignment requires. But to produce it, it involves research and videos, looking at ads, group projects. For the project we did in consumer math, I actually hosted small group meetings for each of the groups. I had 8 groups with about 3 kids in each group, 3 to 4, and we picked out a time that worked for all of us, and we met online in a webinar in a small group setting. I walked them through the project then and showed an example. A lot of times I do include examples with the assessments or similar type of projects that I'm looking for, so they know what to look for. How many are there and what do each reflect? And we went through in the beginning a lot of the main ones that I've done so far this school year in my 3 classes that I teach. Again, looking at them as works in progress. I feel an obstacle of being able to hit all of my standards and produce quality performance assessments, and we'll hit on that as we look at the pros and cons later. But at this point, I've done about 7 or 8, not including those mini writing assignments. And how do the performance assessments relate to the standards? I mean, they directly relate. In math, it's pretty cut and dry. If we're working on our probability project, my standards are going to align to those probability standards. Again, in that particular project, I did have it broken up per group based on where their standardized testing scores placed them. So in that way, I do vary a little bit. But for the most part, the unit circle, there's a whole topic on trigonometry in the unit circle in the standards, and they tie in very nicely. It's always pretty straightforward in math how I can relate my performance assessments, my projects, to those standards. And how do they relate to the curriculum? Again, very similarly, my curriculum is driven by my textbooks. As I mentioned in my video on standards, it's important to make sure that those textbooks accurately align with your Common Core standards and you're hitting everything. But I do follow the curriculum laid out in the textbook, and when applicable, I'll add in those performance assessments. So we might take a 2 or 3 week break from our textbook to complete a specific assessment and then come back to our textbook. But they all fall into place nicely there. And then the rubrics, and we'll show some examples of those at the end of the presentation here, but I love using a rubric. Because I'm math, I like a right answer. I like a clear-cut process, which, as talked about in the readings for the performance assessments, isn't the case with these performance assessments. However, I think rubrics are a great bridge to get us there, so I use them a lot. I have one standard rubric it's just called Writing and Mathematics. And it was actually taken as a whole school. We created a writing and math, or a writing rubric a couple years ago, even before I was actually at the school. They created this, and then over the course of the last year or so, the math department has adjusted that to fit math writing, so it incorporates in their mathematical correctness. But I like to create mine, other than the writing and math that has been created for me through my school. You like to start with a Rubistar, just because I think that they have a lot of great topics, and then I edit it to fit the assessment as needed. So the strengths and the challenges with these performance assessments. And I talk about the ones listed in the text, and then I have a few of my own as well. And it's similar kind of format that for every challenge, typically there's a strength that accompanies it. So it's just making sure that you're looking at it with the right point of view. And the first challenge is that it can be time consuming, especially for a newer teacher. I'm only in my 4th year of teaching, and I'm in my 2nd year of teaching at strictly online. And so finding the time to go beyond, here's my fill in the blank notes, here's the problems online to do, here's the additional worksheet. Finding the time in my schedule that allows me to create a big project like this is definitely a challenge. It's probably the biggest challenge I face. However, I do strongly believe that it's worth it. And in those little projects, maybe not complete performance assessments yet, but what I'm working to get there, I've seen such good results that I know it's worth it to keep finding the time and pushing through. Another challenge we see is a lack of resources. And that can be looked at as a challenge and as a strength in the online community. I can't hand students algebra tiles and have them work with them, but it opens up the door to creativity for myself and all of these other opportunities that we can do. Virtual field trips if we're looking at something like that. Even the WebQuest budget, since kids live all over the state and kids have all different resources to them, they could tailor their budget to fit themselves, and we have the resources for that. So the lack of resources, like I said, is also a strength in that online we have more opportunities to explore those sorts of things. The challenge of needing continuous collaboration is probably solely the biggest challenge that I face in terms of accurate performance assessments in my math class. We don't have a program in place for my school. We are a K through 12 school, and we've got about 200 kids in our high school, so we're decent size, but we don't have any sort of plan in place. And in fact, because our kids typically have unique stories, they're your non-traditional students, my classes themselves are made up of all grades, and they're in all different classes. So we don't necessarily have, these are 12th grade classes, these are 11th grade classes. With kids coming to us mid-year, we have just lots of challenges with getting that cross-collaboration to be effective. Now, a strength there is that we do already have our teams in place. Even K-12, we've got grouped by grade level in the high school, split into 2 teams, and with all of the different content areas meeting. So the time frame is there, the collaboration is there, it's just the need to want to follow through with performance assessment cross-curriculum. The challenge of an emphasis on bubble testing, and especially in math, is true, I think, not just in my school, but in a lot of schools. Now, I do think that there is a time and a place for that in the math classroom, because there are times that we do just want to make sure we know the process. But there's certainly way more times that a performance assessment will produce useful results, things students can do beyond the walls of the classroom, and be much more beneficial to them. So that challenge comes with a very strong strength of making it, again, worth it. One of the challenges that I personally see is making sure that you take a performance assessment and that you can take the time out of your regularly scheduled instruction to implement this performance assessment, but yet still hit the standards. Now, I know that you can group multiple standards. You can have one performance assessment talk all about logarithms, and you can look at mortgages, because that mortgage calculation rates typically use logarithms. And I know that it's doable, but it's kind of a roadblock for me, is making sure that I'm still doing my job to hit those standards, whether it be traditionally or non-traditionally. And the last challenge that I find is to find truly relative performance assessments for all standards. I think that sometimes we get so caught up in answering the question, why do I need to use this in math? Where am I going to use this in my everyday life? And a lot of what we learn in math is also just about becoming problem solvers. It's about the process of taking on a challenge and finishing it. So, although of course there are completely relevant good uses for math, it's also about just taking your challenge to the next level and really becoming critical thinkers and problem solvers. So performance assessment kind of falls somewhere in the middle with that. So the planning template and the quality rubric were very helpful. The template, I thought, did a great job of asking the essential questions. So in answering each of those questions in the template, you made sure you were hitting the wide variety of what the performance assessment was looking for. It clearly defined the components and aligned with the learning targets and standards. I thought it'll be a great place for me to go to take my work in progress performance assessments and turn them into full-blown performance assessments. I certainly will use that as I move forward next year, or if I implement another one yet this year in my classroom, because it gives me a place to make sure I'm hitting all of those. And with that quality rubric does a similar type of thing for me. It requires me to self-evaluate, to make sure that, hey, is this assessment good? Is this assessment going to hit these standards, and is it going to be reliable and valid? And it forces me to answer all those questions for each individual assessment. So I do really like that template and rubric, and we'll certainly go back to it as I continue to evolve from having projects into having performance assessments. So the last few slides here are just a few quick snapshots of my rubrics. I've also included them in the link in my journal and Blackboard, so you can see them there. But this is the one, my go-to one, whether it be for a paragraph that my geometry students are writing or a 2-page paper that my pre-calc trig students are writing. And it really is fairly simplistic, but it does a good job of hitting on all the important things. Of course, mathematical correctness, and depending on the problem, I might weight that at more than just one. Clarity and organization, style fluency, and grammar mechanics. Now, with this rubric, when I assign this to students, I also include the paragraph writing student checklist. And this gives them a starting point, gives them questions to answer before they submit a problem. And it gives them kind of guiding points to continue to make their writing better. So again, I know we talked about writing isn't necessarily the best performance assessment, but it's a step above simply answering a bunch of math questions in a homework. The last one I have here, there's a few more listed in my Blackboard assignment, is the Look at the Unit Circle project. Since that included a presentation, I have that additional in there. Neatness and organization, diagrams and sketches, completions, and then again, mathematical concepts. We can't forget about that in math. When we're looking at rubrics, we still have to make sure that they're doing the math right, but then we also want to include these other pieces. And I've always been so impressed with the diagrams and sketches my kids come up with that take the unit circle kind of to the next level. So as a whole, that's a look at my work in progress performance assessments in my classroom and how I can use the given tools to continue to grow those and make learning better for my students. Thank you.